Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's tape number 422, January the 4th, 1980, the first tape of 1980. Happy New Year. It seems kind of strange saying Happy New Year when the world is on the verge of such cataclysmic events. But for some reason or other, which I can't explain, I guess it has to do with basic personality or philosophy of life, I don't feel depressed. I see the news as terrible, and yet I wake up optimistic each day, not in a foolish optimistic way, but not in a sad way, and I don't really know why, because things are pretty tragic out there. Bob Trevor was on KGO last night. He's the most intelligent newscaster in San Francisco on the 24-hour talk show. He was on the early hours of the morning, and I woke up around 4 o'clock. I turned on the radio, and he was talking about cutting his wrists and sitting in a tub of water and literally wanting to die because the calls were so pessimistic for the year ahead, the future year ahead. I don't feel that way. I can't explain it, but I don't. And let's get on to the news of this week. Before I get into a lot of the material that I'm going to be sharing with you, which I think is terribly important, I think it is every week, and some articles are keys to the past and the future, and we have a few of those to share at this time. I do want to give you the address on the printed sheet and tell you, for people listening to the radio programs where this tape is played, that there is a newsletter put out by a gentleman in Florida. It's called the King Alfred Research Project. It's a very unsophisticated form. I mean, it's just copies of very important articles, and it's a good way of getting resource material from somebody who is out there looking for these clues and links to the way we are being manipulated. You can send for this. It's just a small newsletter, and I'll give you the address. It's in care of the King Alfred Research Project in Jacksonville, Florida. The subscription is $3 for 8 to 12 pages, and he prints 300 copies. Capers Thompson is the person doing this, and in this package that comes out, he has some very good articles that I will be referring to from time to time, but it saves that much time on the tape if you can just pick up the whole collection. He also has on the back a resource list, which is important, and he mentions the he has 13 various organizations or persons, such as myself, getting out tapes and newsletters, and most of these are fairly inexpensive, and you can keep up with the committees and write to these people for more information on reopening the Rosenberg case and Alpine Enterprises, the Conspiracy Digest. When you get that newspaper, then you also get sheets of addresses and lists of books that are available, addresses of people doing other work. It turns you on to a whole network of concerned citizens around the world, and particularly in the United States. And I think that's one of the things that helps keep my sanity up during these times when the news is so bad, is that I'm only in contact with people who are concerned, who are thinking about these problems, and I don't spend time trying to proselytize or turn people on to the fact that there are conspiracies and they get rejected and hurt. I simply stay with people who already know something of what is coming down and want to know more, and it's an intellectual and emotional challenge, and it bonds you with a type of person that I call a concerned person, and that makes your life much more rich and less helpless when you're in contact with all these various individuals or pieces of literature coming in and become familiar with them. Several years ago I had a woman on KLRB, and it was on the tapes that went out, who's an organizer for the demonstrations against the Shah of Iran, and they had a newspaper coming out of Chicago called Resistance, and many listeners started taking that right after I got my subscriptions. The Shah was out, but they're still active in other ways, and it's good to keep in touch with these people and know how other people are feeling before the country changes hands, and to understand some of the violence and torture and exploitation. Sit and talk about those things so that you're not so taken back when these cataclysmic events take place. If you don't have the printed sheet that accompanies this particular tape or broadcast, it's King Alfred Research Project, Post Office Box 12305, Jacksonville, Florida 32209. The Associated Press had a story this week that disease samples are shipped unmarked in commercial airplanes. This came out of Atlanta, Georgia. That dangerous disease samples are transported on passenger airplanes illegally, and that this hazardous material should be refused. They're in unmarked containers. They're shipped to medical centers across the nation from various researchers. And Dr. Johnson of the National Center for Disease Control said that he knows there's never been infection as a result of shipping these viruses, bacteria, disease tissue samples, but there could be. The Center for Disease Control said that there's a slim chance that an isolate could escape and spread disease among cargo passengers, and that we ought to get into it. It's really a dangerous thing, that if it were broken open, something terrible would happen. There are about 300 reports in the last 7 years of transportation personnel who spotted, according to this report, a leaking or broken container with a red warning label with a telephone number to report to the health authorities. The labels are supposed to be crucial, with only trained medical epidemiologists opening disease packages. And they warn the dangers of airplanes going to airports like International, New York, and so forth, because they could ship thousands of disease-filled containers each day. I just bring that up because it's typical of the insanity of our society that we're shipping these things around the country and endangering the population. I hear about Asian flu or Russian flu or China flu and various predictions of getting flu vaccine, and I just wonder how much disease, knowing the CIA and their way of experimentations, is administered to us and keep the population generally at large and at sick leave and under the weather. Years from now, we'll probably be reading that they deposit disease just as the Americans did, putting smallpox on blankets and then sending the horses with those blankets into the Indian reservations so that thousands of Indians would die from smallpox. This started long before the CIA, but the mentality to allow the CIA to do these things was formed from the habits that preceded it and has never been forbidden, and nobody is punished. Every time we read about CIA experiments and pneumonia and chemical experiments, it's just simply one news event that makes the front page, and I never yet have read a prosecution of the people who are doing it or did it. Only those people, namely the Scientologists and their group for justice in government, are the ones that are put in jail for divulging the information. The people who are doing it, and nothing happens to them, just the people who tell us that it's happening. Gerald Ford was invited to the White House December 14th, that was about 3 weeks ago, to meet Jimmy Carter on the hostage problem, the Iranian problem, and there was a quotation going back 3 weeks ago, which I hadn't shared with you, because Ford was put in after Richard Nixon was removed by that Scotch tape that we talked about several weeks ago, so that Kissinger, Haig, and Rockefeller would have a firm control over the White House, and with Ford as appointed president, then Nelson Rockefeller became vice president. The sentence that I want to share with you was that Gerald Ford was quoted as saying, from the very beginning, I have said this is probably the most serious international crisis since the end of World War II. It is absolutely essential that we have unity support of the president. The taking of the hostages, allowing the Shah in this country, and then the taking of the hostages is setting the stage to get our troops into the Middle East and surround the Soviet Union and get ready for that World War III that Mr. Brzezinski and Kissinger and their fellow men, if you can call them men, have been cooking up since the end of World War II. Jimmy Carter's rivals are accusing him of using Iran to duck political debates, and as you all know, he refused to debate with the other candidates, Jerry Brown and Ted Kennedy. This week, he has become the wartime president that he is. He has shed the peanut farmer cloak that I have talked about. For those of you that have taken the tapes continuously, there are many new listeners, and as I keep saying, we can't go back all the time. You'll have to just get the other tapes to fill in or pick up from here. But Jimmy Carter was a graduate of Annapolis in the class of 47. He went there with L. Patrick Gray, the acting director of FBI at the time of the Watergate crisis, who was put in there when J. Edgar Hoover was killed. He was an old man, but he was killed so that the Annapolis graduate would be the acting director of the FBI, and of course Stansfield Turner, the head of the CIA, the classmate of Jimmy Carter. He has shed his peanut farmer cloak, and he's now gone into the role of the Annapolis Navy intelligence captain of the ship, ready for the war, and he's just not about to debate with any of the candidates. When I made these statements months ago, several months ago, and I think I've shared this with you before, there were some listeners that thought it would be impossible that Jimmy Carter could use the hostages or prolong this thing for a warfare state. I think many of you are beginning to see now that that's far from impossible. Mr. Waldheim, another German, not Waldheim, it's spelled that way, Waldheim, Kissinger, Brzezinski, the whole team that came over here from Europe are very much in control of our foreign national policy. Mr. Waldheim went to Tehran to meet with the heads of government to discuss the hostage problem. I think when he got there, he realized how much the people in Tehran, all of them, hate the Shah, hate the United States. I think that he was hoping to find some links in the chain that could be broken, some weaknesses, some pleading for us to come over there. And of course, everybody who goes over there understands that they're interviewed by people who have been tortured by the Savak and mistreated, or members of their family are killed. Mr. Waldheim did not meet a friendly group when he was there, and there was talk of an assassination plot against his life. It reminded me of the trip of Dag Hammarskjöld. I don't know how many of you read any books or articles on the death of Hammarskjöld, September 18th, 1961. He went to the Congo and to South Rhodesia to make some form of peace. At the time, he was Secretary General of the United Nations when he was murdered there on a peace mission. In this case, if Waldheim had been murdered, if the protection weren't good enough, it would have been another reason to escalate the war, and he could have been sent there to be sacrificed. There were assassination attempts, I understand, on him, and he was protected. He left a cemetery where he was supposed to visit, and of course he can't be in the streets publicly seen. But that could have been another incendiary if Waldheim had been killed. As it is, he is still alive, and so that is one less excuse at the time being to get angry. But Dag Hammarskjöld, on a same type of mission, was murdered in 1961. Jimmy Carter has recalled the ambassador to Moscow. This ambassador, Thomas Watson, is president of IBM, hardly sympathetic to the Soviet Union and been part of that internal business clique that had been anti-Soviet for years. All they'll talk about is the invasion of Afghanistan, but there isn't much that they're going to be able to do about that, short of bringing in troops to supply the rebels. The Soviet Union is afraid of the United States. They're absolutely aware of the war plans for 1985. Mr. Brzezinski has coaxed NATO to put those atomic missiles in 7 countries in Western Europe facing the Soviet Union. The New York Times had an analysis this week of why the Soviet Union was forced into Afghanistan, and it's pretty close to my way of thinking, with one error. Their article begins by saying that driven by historic near paranoia about the security of its borders, they considered it an unparalleled threat of instability across their southern frontier. Paranoia is a mental disease of fearing an enemy that does not, in fact, exist. Reality is seeing the enemy closing in on you. The Soviet Union is literally isolated because China has become a branch of our Central Intelligence Agency since the death of Mao. All of Western Europe is against the Soviet Union, and if the hostages affair allows us to bring our troops into the Middle East, and with Japan making financial control of South Korea with the death of Parks and maybe combining North and South, the Soviet Union would be totally isolated. So they have to take their strategic moves now, which is not paranoia, it's reality. The Washington Post said the Soviets intend to convert the once autonomous nation into another Mongolia, the total subservient Soviet garrison puppet state that once was set up in 1921 along their Chinese border. The Soviets are considering Afghanistan an integral part of the Soviet military zone and foresee a virtual state of occupation for many years to come. The reasons they give in this Washington Post article, which again I say are similar to mine, is that the SALT Treaty never was going to take place. Our Senate was against it. We have a group of senators that want war, that want a détente to be ended. It never really existed except in spelling the word. There's been nothing but a continual confrontation with the Soviet Union. There was a desire to send the plate chorus line over there 2 weeks ago, and the money was pulled back and won't come because the Soviets would send over a group of their artists in exchange. And when they send the ballet, we have coaxed these various people to stay on this side because of the Cold War stature and the prestige of getting them to jump to the American side. The SALT agreements, which the Soviet Union wanted and warned about, were never, ever going to pass the Senate. The rapprochement with China ended in 1976, and although Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon opened up those borders, and it was very prestigious for Richard Nixon's re-election, they sent in Mr. Bush, who was the director of the CIA, and he was the ambassador to China, and now the post-Mao leadership has swung so that China is our 51st state. If it isn't Israel or Puerto Rico or Mexico, and it's not Mexico, although we'd like it to be, China is literally controlled it. In exchange for billions of dollars of industry and business and opening up business, we have allowed them to become traditionally anti-Russian, the two giants facing each other anyway, but they're in our camp. So the Soviet Union has broken their rapprochement with China, and they're surrounded, according to the Washington Post, and you can see at the map, if you take a map and follow it this week. They also mention the revival of Turkey, Iran, and Pakistan into an Islamic revival, and this would threaten the Soviet Union along that border. And the reasoning or the logic of their moving in, as detailed in the Post, is similar to what I see, that the American position has never been weaker. If we come in with strong weapons and try to get the hostages, they will be killed. If they're killed, we will begin using a bombing of the oil fields and making war over there. And in return, the Muslim countries could pull back our oil and retaliate and cut off the bulk of the oil supplies for the United States. We are economically strangled with the price of gold going so high, jumping very high. The oil, the financial situation has America's back against the wall. It's a hard time to make a war, so this is the strategic moment for the Russians to step in, because they know that the people that run this country hate them, the media is against them, every single thing they do, so they may as well secure their borders while they can. Jack Anderson had a concise article this week called The Shah's System. Many of you don't get the Anderson columns, some of you do, so I just want to mention some that are very important. He tells how the Shah of Iran, of course, was put in by early articles. He tells about the Rockefeller-Kissinger CIA connections. Then he tells how Henry Kissinger and the Shah raised our oil prices in the Middle East so drastically, and then how William Rogers, who was Secretary of the State, left the State Department and then became the head of the Pahlevi institution, the foundation run by the Shah, and his financial investments. In 1973, at the height of the Watergate exposures, William Rogers left the State Department to head the Shah's financial foundations, and the head of our CIA, Richard Helms, who was instrumental in putting the Shah in, then went to Iran in 1973 to 77 and became the ambassador to Iran, and would tip off people who were anti-Shah in order to keep the Shah's power going. He had a firm called Safeer, S-A-F-E-E-R, an Iranian word for ambassador, when he came back, a consulting firm, and his biggest client was the Shah of Iran. And Senator Jacob Javits and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee defended the Shah in Congress for the Senate, and his wife, of course, was a lobbyist, received $67,000 for the Iran Airlines, and that was a cover for pro-Shah lobbying. So while there was a lot of anti-Shah feeling and a hatred of the Shah of Iran and the United States and the CIA, he had William Rogers investing. The Shah had his money in the foundation, and the head of our CIA controlling matters at home so that the anti-Shah feeling would be suppressed, and there'd be goon squads and the Savak in the United States silencing the people who objected to what was going on in Iran. Over in Iran, the Savak could take care of it themselves, but the CIA and the Savak suppressed the real hatred or feelings for so many years by having goon squads and attacking and killing and controlling the news media. Now I'm going to leave Iran and Afghanistan and the international scenes over there for something important that was in the news this past week that has been pushed off the headlines of most newspapers, and we don't want to lose these articles as they are occurring. One section of articles has to do with the Central Intelligence Agency, assassination teams, terrorism, a cast of characters that will run down the line. It has to do with the arrest of two men in New York City described as gun runners, but when you read the collection of articles that have come out so far, and there are only 3 or 4, it involves the Central Intelligence Agency, the Green Beret, former Marines, a professional hitman, an assassin, a team of assassination trainers, a man that's training assassins, Scotland Yard, Exxon, Mobil Oil, a New Jersey electronics firm called Amstec Corporation, a Washington, D.C. CIA cover front called Oceanic Corporation. This involves Paris, Panama, London, a cast of characters with CIA safe houses, millions of dollars of weapons for Idi Amin, millions for Libya, millions for the PLO. It's linked, these 2 men that were arrested in New York are linked to the Munich Olympic Games, the killing of 11 Israeli athletes, the FLAN, the Puerto Rican terrorists, the anti-Castro Cubans. There's a can of worms that has just been barely broken into by the arrest of 2 people, where this is a large multinational private army, a continuation of that COINTEL program that was going when Richard Nixon was very much entrenched in office in 1971. 2 agents from this team, this international team, were arrested at the Hilton Hotel in New York City, and we'll get into the details of what this arrest could mean if it weren't covered up. And again, the Iranian crisis will try to push it out of the news media, and we'll discuss the way the media is handling it. But before I get into that, I want to take 2 steps. One is the Korean CIA and the assassination teams, international assassination teams. Then there is the Great Britain, London, which is the Permindex, the South American assassination teams with headquarters in Paris, New Jersey, Washington, London, and then combine the agents from both the Korean and the anti-Castro Cuban CIA, and you have a world network of rightist, multi-million-dollar funded terrorism that is causing bombings, airport hijackings, murders. This is not left-wing radical terrorism for more rights. It's not like the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. These are right-wing CIA terrorists who are doing these killings in order to get more police on the streets, to keep people off guard, to kill civil rights leaders, political leaders, to do poison dart deaths that make it look as if the Russians were doing them. We have a network around the world of assassins, assassination weapons, silencers, and so forth. The globe is pretty well covered if you mark it off. But just this week, as I say, there were 2 articles of these particular things that I'm describing, which are really Nazi terrorisms that were started after World War II, but which are servicing now. Last week, there was an article in the Washington Post, December 22nd, 1979. Another one in the New York Times, December the 20th, 1979. The lead article saying, ex-CIA agent claims the CIA knew of Korean bribery campaign. The other headline article said, ex-CIA officer charges agency withheld data on Korean bribery. The articles involve a gentleman by the name of Philip Leahy, L-I-E-C-H-T-Y. He was the 4th highest-ranking CIA agent in Seoul, Korea, and he claims that the CIA deliberately suppressed information of our U.S. congressmen that they knew as early as 1970 and 71, the height of the Nixon period, just prior to the breaking of Watergate in June 72. They were already providing women and money and jewelry, sexual favors and briberies in order to control a Congress that would go along with Nixon's COINTEL program and his what was the Operation Chaos in the United States and all over the world. This matter of Korean bribery was only investigated after Nixon was out of office, and the Watergate stories had been taken off the newspaper headlines for a while. In 1975, they were investigated. But this gentleman claims that the CIA had reports in 1971 and 72 that members of our Congress were being paid off. Now, he claims the Justice Department never investigated that we send our men or women, that these were particularly men, that were being bribed and kept with prostitutes and money from various sections of 50 states around the United States to represent us in Washington, D.C. And when they get there, they're kept with Korean Asian women and money to run their elections at home, so they don't really need us. And then the CIA knows this and controls them, and the Justice Department refuses to prosecute. And in that way, we're not represented at all, and the whole idea of the constitutional balance, the checks and balances, goes out the window because the Congress is bribed and paid off, the judicial is strangled and won't prosecute, and the president is put in by these same corrupt forces of the CIA, so that the people, us out there, pay our taxes for the various wars and so forth, or our medical bills if we're poisoned. But this has been going on a long time. The Washington Post article said that the CIA feared that its budget would be curtailed by vindictive congressmen if it ever came out. Well, the truth is that the CIA budget is insured by keeping women for the congressmen. That's the way the budget is raised all the time, and there's no holds on the CIA because the CIA supplies them with their sex and money, and then if they don't give the CIA the money they need, then the CIA can have a scandal and break their reputations. The name of the game, according to Leahy, is sex and booze, all good things Asia had to offer. He was told when he was in the CIA that, and had this high position, that don't ask about Tongsun Park, and the agents told him, don't say anything. He's having a conflict. It's a matter of a divorce case in Washington where this came out. In the course of his personal character, he brought out that he wanted these things open in 71 and was told not to do it. And also the CIA, by keeping this quiet and forcing these situations on the congressmen, assured them of their own funds. The 1978 report of CIA bribery, the one that just came out last year of the Senate Intelligence Committee, was a cover-up, according to Leahy. And of course we know it was. The great Leon Jaworski headed the Koreagate investigation, and you know how many congressmen, Speaker of the House O'Neill or Carl Albert and so forth, none were prosecuted, even though they kept their little halls, even for bed hopping, right next to the congressional offices. There were places there for them to do their little afternoon matinees or whatever they wanted. Leon Jaworski, who was on the Warren Commission to protect the CIA and the state of Texas for killing President John Kennedy, was brought in as a prosecutor for Nixon's Watergate. Then he was brought in for Koreagate. This gentleman claimed that the report of the Senate Intelligence Committee covered up also the foreign assassinations, that they lied about that the CIA concealed for the Senate Committee and covered up, and this is the important thing, the assassinations of people overseas. We know they covered up American assassinations. Mr. Blakey, G. Robert Blakey, just finished covering up, again, the murder of John Kennedy and Martin Luther King. But Jaworski's committee, again, asked the CIA members if they had any direct knowledge of assassinations. The question should be, did they have indirect knowledge, because the CIA works on a need-to-know basis. But according to Mr. Leahy, by asking them if they had any direct knowledge, they could say no, and that the killing of persons, foreign leaders or overseas or even domestically, was covered up by the Central Intelligence Agency on purpose by the witnesses they called and the questions they asked. So that the Washington Post did have an article this week on the continuous cover-up of assassinations, again headed by Leon Jaworski. He says, Mr. Leahy said they covered up the stories of torture in South Korea and corruption, bribery, and sex. The lady alleged that from 1969 to July 1973, the CIA manipulated all intelligence reports to support any predetermined foreign policy objections objectives of President Nixon and Henry Kissinger, that the CIA worked with them, lying on the excuse it would hurt national security if the covert operations were really exposed.
We are here to serve you.
This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California, side 2 of tape 422, January the 4th, 1980. As I said on the other side of the tape, with the exception of the Washington Post article and the New York Times article, one day there was nothing about the expose of the assassination team cover-up, the bribery cover-up in Washington, D.C., or the Senate investigation covering up the truth about the briberies and payoffs and the assassinations. This has been suppressed in every newspaper that I take, and I'm reading about 10 papers a day. As a matter of fact, when this information came out that first day in a court in Washington, D.C., the CIA came in and slapped a silence on the case. They've sealed off all the documents and information and asked the judge to withhold from this. It's a divorce trial that's going on where it came out. A Judge Orrin Lewis, a federal district court judge in Alexandria, Virginia, not in Washington, ordered the CIA statements by Mr. Lay to be kept secret, and the attorneys have been forbidden to disseminate any of the substance or statements that he was talking about. Now, none of this material that came out that one day is part of a CIA case. They're not involved in the court case at all as CIA people. They're just two individuals involved that happen to be CIA members, and this information came out. There has been blockage of the news, but you could see why, because at a time like this that the president wants national unity, those darn assassinations and payoffs keep surfacing. And again, it's the team of Nixon and Kissinger, and then the continuation of Kissinger and Rockefeller with the control of Jimmy Carter. There's a linear connection there because of the trilateral Nelson-Rockefeller group selecting Jimmy Carter as president, and you could see why they would want him in office, to keep the lid on all their past crimes that have to be covered and tidied under. You know, it's like having the house cleaning girl. Every week you take everything, or daily, and hide all the dirt and sweep it away so nobody sees it. And it's very important to keep that team right up in there in Washington so all of this information doesn't burst out and some inquisitive reporters don't get on it. So far, that Korean story has been concealed. Now, the other story, the main story that I want to talk about, is two articles that came out in December 24th and December 25th in the New York Times. Several newspapers out here just had the slightest mention of this information, and it has to do with international gun running and weapons assassination teams, as I mentioned before, with front offices in Washington, D.C., New Jersey, Panama, Paris, and London. It has to do with these radical terrorist groups, or the so-called bad guys, who are actually connected to the Central Intelligence Agency, the FALN, the Puerto Rican terrorists, the anti-Castro Cubans, and the CIA, Uganda and Idi Amin, Libya, Palestine Liberation Organization. These people are being funded with weapons from, in quotes, former CIA Green Beret agents, and this has to do with violence all over the world, from Washington, D.C. to California. I don't think we'll have a chance to list all of their violences, and it also has to do with Scotland Yard, Exxon, and Mobil oil companies, and of course those are Standard Oil. And then we get back to Rockefeller and Nelson Rockefeller and David Rockefeller and the oil companies as being linked to these national terrorist rights groups. They're being supplied bombs and weapons and are doing murders for them and around. The terrorism is excuse for police, and police enhance their power because the people have less chance to speak up or revolt against them. The New York Times headline story was December 24th, 10,000 guns, agents seized 2 in city, that means New York City, in $2 million machine gun sale. The New York Daily News the headline on this was ex-CIA agent held in $2.5 million arms deal. The San Jose Mercury had a small article, 2 arrested for selling 10,000 guns. The New York Post top story was gun runner bust linked to FALN. That's a Puerto Rican radical group. And then the San Francisco later ran a little article, 2 accused in a $2 million arm scheme. Our Monterey Herald describes ex-CIA New Jersey's firm's boss charged as gun runner. Now, it's this New Jersey firm that supplies weapons and security for Exxon Mobil and Scotland Yard. The weapons mentioned in some of these articles were briefcase bombs, letter bombs, hand grenades, poison darts, firearms, booby traps, silencers for assassinations, .22 caliber silencers made specifically for assassination teams. Now, at the New York Hilton Hotel, the 2 men were arrested, a Frank Edward Terpil, who was a CIA agent until 1971. And these articles are careful to say that he was fired or left the CIA, discrepancies here, in 1971. Now, that's the same year that Agent James McCord and E. Howard Hunt left the CIA. 1971 is when they left the CIA. They'd worked there for 20 years and 18 years, the 2 of them. And then they went on, and McCord opened an office called McCord Associates, which was a private firm which was 100% CIA agents. And then E. Howard Hunt went to work for the White House as a 100% CIA agent. So leaving the CIA in 1971 and branching to world terrorism with rightist organizations, with this anti-Castro Cubans and various violences around the world, is consistent with the Operation Chaos, the COINTEL program, and the plans that Richard Nixon had domestically and internationally for us, and with the assassination teams that had put him into power. It took the deaths of John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King, with the riots that followed, that escalated Nixon into power that he wanted so badly and couldn't get until he achieved it over the corpse of these various people. Frank Terpil is former CIA, 40 years old, lives in McLean, Virginia. The CIA refused comment about him. He has provided arms to Libya. He supplied millions of dollars, $3.2 million in weapons to Uganda. Idi Amin, of course, there was silenced up. Recently, the CIA team that assisted Idi Amin, a man came back to Oregon when Amin left office, and he was part of the basketball team and the CIA entourage. The United States can supply Idi Amin just like they do of Shah of Iran and they're called publicly the bad guys, but $3.2 million in weapons was sold to Amin by the CIA, by CIA agent Terpil alone. And Terpil would travel to Uganda every 3 months. He was selling communication equipment. And the cover for Terpil is the Oceanic Corporation in Washington, D.C. Now, being as there are just several articles out, and this just started breaking last week, if it had the momentum of Watergate, if we didn't have the Iranian-Afghanistan crisis, there could be more people going into the Oceanic Corporation. So to find the links to the Central Intelligence Agency, if this links to Letelier, because this group also worked with the anti-Castro Cubans, if it links into the murder of Letelier or Sandra Moffat or Colonia Dignidad down in Chile, that we've done tapes on many times with their assassination teams and weapons, if we make that final connection of the Oceanic Corporation or the Amstec Corporation, the electronic firm in New Jersey, you have the worldwide network of that Odessa, the Nazi organization, the assassination teams, killing heads of state, civil rights leaders, and bombing radical bookstores and so forth all over the world. This is a network which could make very important connections, because you have Reverend Moon, the Korean CIA, with their assassination teams that this gentleman was talking about in his divorce case there in Virginia this last week. And then these arrests combined to make a very important network. A third man was involved. He was arrested but not held on the gun charges. He's held as a material witness, and Don Ducher, along with Frank Terpil and George Korkola, the third man, is a self-proclaimed assassin. He's a hired hitman. They released him. If they know he's an assassin, they haven't said who he's killed or what assignments he gets or how he gets them. Of course, that hasn't come out yet. This Terpil, as I say, was close to Amin. George Gergely Korkola was the other man arrested as a co-conspirator. Now, he got around New York City with diplomatic plates. He has an automobile from the United Nations registered under the Uganda mission, and he's the owner of the Amstec Corporation, an electronics firm which was raided by the FBI in New Jersey that had the weapons and silencers and so forth. I'm wondering if the weapons for Jonestown came from the Amstec Corporation in New Jersey. There were a group of people that were linked to Georgetown at the time of Jonestown that also died in New Jersey. I don't want to branch too far off of that, but you can see that the connecting links, those of you that are familiar with the past research can see as I relate what's in these several articles, some of the things that are going through my mind. They also supply weapons for the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and the CIA is a very anti-Semitic, rightist organization that would be funding the PLO to take pot shots and attack Israel. They sold an undercover agent in New York City a .22 caliber long rifle, especially designed for assassinations. And again, the question is, who made the rifles? Was it Mitchell Werbel? And some of these rifles came from England, some from the United States, but who is making them? Because Werbel was supplying assassination weapons, and of course his location is in Georgia, not far from Jimmy Carter's home. These gentlemen had, the CIA had a hotel that was Hunter's Lodge Hotel. It was purchased by Mr. Terpil in 1978 for $500,000. That was just last year in Crewe, England. And this lodge held fellow agents. It's run by a man named David Jenner, who works for Terpil, and he has not been arrested. Scotland Yard went there and raided the place and took out information and weapons, but said they believed that this was a CIA hotel and safe house. Terpil had two hotels and two private homes. There are 4 safe houses in England that are linked to the New Jersey firm, and they also have offices in Washington, D.C., and in Paris, and in Panama. And, of course, we have the London connections of Jonestown with Tim Stone and Terry Buford and Jim Jones. And the formation of Jonestown was formed by a representative from London going down there. Remember my earlier tapes on London. And, of course, there was gun running and assassination teams and money from Jonestown, not only in London and in Paris, but in Panama, millions of dollars. And, of course, this team, according to these several articles, have offices in Panama and Paris, 4 safe houses in London, CIA front for electronics equipment in New Jersey, and an Oceanic Corporation in Washington, D.C. I'm repeating some of this to tie together as I go along the loose ends so you begin to get the picture. Frank Terpil was an important man. He claims, as he was posing to the agents who arrested him, they were disguised as Latin American revolutionaries. He claimed credit for training the terrorists who killed the 11 Israeli athletes at the 1972 Olympic Games. Of course, I have files on massacres, CIA violences, and so forth in Munich, Germany. It was a perfect place to kill those 11 Jews and get away with it. And these men are claiming that they were part of this terrorist activity. If Mr. Terpil left the CIA in 1971, it's interesting that in 1972, when these murders took place, he had trained those terrorists, because that must have been just at the point where he was slipping out of the CIA role and was not in any private business at that time. It was involved with international violence and terrorism and anti-Semitic attacks against 11, Israeli athletes, just young people innocently going to the Olympic Games. This George Korkola, 38 years old, is president, as I say, of Amstec International, and he's a former ex-Green Beret, if there's such a thing. He heads mercenary squads. He has an 11-member mercenary squad where he trains for assassinations and murders, and his headquarters are in New Jersey. During World War II, I.G. Farben had their factories in Nazi concentration camps at Auschwitz. I say that Pope John Paul II is the Polish Pope from Auschwitz. Farben also had headquarters in New Jersey, so that if Hitler lost the war, or if communication broke down of the Nazis in Europe, during that time period, they would have their offices in New Jersey, which they did have for their dyes, international dye cartels, and international terrorism. Pope John Paul II was out this week, January 1st, in the news, the New Year's wish to slow down the arms race, and he condemned international terrorism and the nuclear arms race. And yet, international terrorism is directly linked to John Paul II. He doesn't like it when the left legitimately might want to have vengeance, or the people in Iran have vengeance against the Shah and the Savak and the CIA in the United States, and took the hostages out of anger and frustration. That is called anger and frustration. It is hardly called, I don't call it terrorism. I call it a last stand of desperate people who are not heard by anyone. But I wonder just how tight the Pope's IG Farben connections go to this agency in New Jersey. I'm giving you my thoughts on this because, as I say, the story's just broke, and there's no Woodward or Bernstein back there working on it, and I'm giving you the feelings just as I had the minute they were arrested at Watergate. I had a pretty tight command within 3 weeks to publish Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped? These articles are important. As I say, John Dutcher, the self-proclaimed assassin, is not under arrest, I understand. He's described as a soldier of fortune who agrees to train clandestine armies, and they use the weapons that are sold by Terpil and Korkola. Now, I don't know if Oceanic Corporation in Washington, the CIA front is for Terpil, is a weapon manufacturer. According to the news reports, Korkola's Amtech International is electronics, supplying security, as I say, for Exxon, Rockefeller Mobil, and Scotland Yard. I mean, it's just so outrageous, I can't say it enough. But here's this assassination team of soldiers of fortune, ex-Marine, put quotation marks, Green Beret, CIA, and I wonder, besides electronic equipment, just as I say, who makes the weapons, or is it Mitchell or Bell? This Nazi czarist who left, he's a white Russian who left the Russian, his family left, and he came to this country after the Bolsheviks came in, the communists took over, and he's been training assassination teams and setting up terrorist organizations and weapons and training in Georgia. He flies all over the world and sets up international terrorism. The arrests were made in New York City because there was a group studying the anti-Castro Cuban group, the Omega-7. The Omega-7 have been claiming responsibility for bombings in New York City and across the country, and the arrests were made because of the suspicion that these people were linked to the anti-Castro Cuban group and the Omega-7. I may not have time on the tape this week if I just talk about the arrest at the Hilton Hotel to go into the connecting link of Reverend Moon to the anti-Castro Cubans and the violence in New York City and across the country. But I will, if I don't do it this week, get into an article that was written by Jeff Stein in New York Magazine last September called An Army in Exile, and it talks about the Cuban terrorists just across the Hudson River over in New Jersey and the headquarters for anti-Castro Cuban activity and violence, and that bombings would come from this group. As a matter of fact, the article in New York Magazine said the Letelier assassination was carried out by members of a fascist New Jersey-based group known as the Cuban Nationalist Movement. Credit for the bombings came out of a Mr. Negrin's office. The group called itself Omega-7. The Muniz murder was claimed by the group calling itself CERO, C-E-R-O, or its English equivalent Zero. These are Cuban exiled terrorists. The Omega-7, CERO, the Cuban Nationalist Movement. It says such terrorism continuing into this decade has grim traditions such as it had after the Bay of Pigs and the Watergate days, and it goes into the Letelier killings. Now, we know that the Letelier killings were partly organized by the assassination teams down in Chile with, that's the Martin Bormann Mengeles Nazi headquarters at Colonia Dignidad that I have linked to the Jonestown assassination teams. Many of you who don't have the tapes on Jonestown, Colonia Dignidad, have to get those, the links to Germany and international Nazism, to put this together. But over in New Jersey, a company that supplies for Exxon and Mobil and so forth, and anti-Castro Cuban Watergate violence, bombings from New York, California, And I have a list of 20, 30, 40, 50 violences they have done, which again I'll have to put next week. We won't have time on this tape because I want to set this background firmly that these men were arrested at the Hilton Hotel in New York City this last week, that they have been supplying millions of dollars for Idi Amin. They've been supplying around the world to Uganda, to Libya. The CIA weapons are involved, CIA safe houses in Great Britain. There is this connecting link. I should just have a map of the world, a globe, maybe a little one on the sheet next week, and mark off where these agencies or offices are, or maybe you can get a map of the United States, a stationery store or a bookstore, and begin to mark some of these things I'm saying on the tapes, like in Chile, the Colonia Dignidad area in Chile, and the London, the Scotland Yard, the New Jersey, Uganda. If you get that, you can see this network that has been set since World War II coming together, these violences that are coming together, and each little arrest or suppression of the news media shouldn't be allowed to curtail the importance of this connecting link of fascism. And the important thing is that what we call terrorists from the left, the FALN, the Puerto Ricans, are connected to the anti-Castro Cubans, and that the bombings at airports, at LaGuardia Airport, Francis Tavern in New York, the bookstores in California, the bombing of the Rosenberg sons at a rally in California, endless violences, a secret army organization linked to Richard Nixon in the White House. Down in San Diego at the time of Watergate, they were planning to kill Richard Nixon right then, but Louis Tackwood blew the whistle on that, the agent for the LAPD, so they slid him out at Watergate in '72 instead of killing him at the conventions. This is a network, and 2 of those people were arrested. Now you can imagine how large the network is if just 2 men were arrested in New York City last week. I mean, this is a multi-million-dollar worldwide net, and I'm just going to talk about what came out in the articles just this last week. And except for the 2 that I had, the New York Daily News and Post were sent to me from listeners in New York, friends in New York, and all of you back there, send me your information, because we're getting absolutely nothing out of here except a 1-inch, 2-inch article the day the men were arrested, and I just mentioned the title. Keep sending the articles you have. This Mr. Terpil opened a company in Paris in 1971 for the purpose of supplying and training terrorist organizations. 1971 was the year, as I say, when Hunt and McCord left the CIA, and he went to Paris. Now, all the members of the SLA, the bulk of them were Central Intelligence agents that came to California in 1972 to set up their infiltration of all the leftist organizations in California. You have to read my article. The SLA is the CIA. If you don't have it, you can send for it. It was published in 1974. It's the background of terrorism and Nazi connections in the United States and international connections. Well, people of the SLA, such as Angela Atwood, William Harris, Colston Westbrook, Willie Wolfe, were all in Europe before they came to California in 1972, a good hunk of those people. In 1971, the office was set up in Paris by Mr. Terpil of the CIA to supply and train terrorist organizations. Those would be terror on the right that would infiltrate the left. The left is blamed for terror. The CIA is supplying the weapons and the bombs and the silencers and the trained assassins. Sanze Mercury had one article talking about John Dutcher, the soldier of fortune, the proclaimed assassin, and described him as an ex-Marine who served time in Vietnam and was an ex-Marine. They also described George Korkola, the man who has the electronics firm in New Jersey, as being of the Green Beret, that he was this freelance military specialist, that one of his jobs was to harbor fugitives, sell illegal weapons. He trained terrorists and into military activities, and used a series of front companies throughout the world. It's interesting that the few articles that I have from the New York Daily News, the New York Post, the New York Times, and then the local papers here, our local papers maybe have like a 2-inch column, but it has something that the Eastern paper didn't have. And I want to take notice now, as of January the 4th, 1980, I haven't seen the Washington Post articles on this subject. Some of my papers from the East were held up because of the New Year's holidays, and they're piled up here, and I haven't read all of them. So as of this date, I have not seen anything from the Washington newspapers about Mr. Terpil and his Oceanic Corporation stationed right in Washington, D.C. As I said before, some of the front businesses are located, these serious front companies, in Panama, Paris, and Washington and London, the safe houses. And of course the question of the England and Panama, the Jonestown money, a lot of it in Paris, Panama, and London, which is exactly where these fronts were. Millions of dollars were involved. Remember, Jim Jones ended up with approximately $26 million in 14 international banks where they were training assassination teams, and they were also having people sign false confessions to having committed assassinations that later could be planted. They were unsigned, and somebody could sign their name to them. They confessed assassinations. The assassination teams, and I've talked about this over and over again, are still at large, and I'm wondering if they have been trained by Frank Terpil and George Korkola as part of terrorism around the world, and then they returned back to London safe houses and the hotel in London or New Jersey or Paris to their headquarters when they splintered. Where did they go, and are they linked to this group? Remember when Jim Jones was ready to die, and he asked the people, he talked about 1,200 people that would die, and they had the passports for many more than actually died there, 923 that died. So approximately 170 escaped. A boat was taken off to the Barbados. People, the assassination teams that turned the bodies over face down, have all escaped. And have they gone back to these offices where the money was? Here's Paris, London, New Jersey, Washington, D.C. Have they split? And are they getting ready for violences in other places? And what is the Panama connection? Trujillo's is down there. The Shah is there. The international banking concerns, the terrorism that comes out of Panama. What are the investments of Jim Jones in Panama, the millions of dollars? Was it Terry Buford, I believe, who made the deposits? Who has the money? Does the money go back to Mr. Frank Terpil and John Dutcher and Mr. Korkola? How are they linked? Are they linked to the millions of dollars, the weapons, the drugs, the experiments in Jonestown, the assassination teams, and again to the Chilean connection, this network of people throughout the world, but these strategic areas keep coming through over and over again with the same modus and the same modus operandi. In my first article, published article after 8 years research called Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped, I talked about the denial of the CIA when they're caught red-handed. Their first obligation is to deny that they know who they are. Remember, Richard Nixon and John Mitchell didn't know who James McCord was, even though he was chief of security for the committee to re-elect the president. It was on the Pentagon panel for emergencies in the United States. When he was arrested at Watergate, they denied they know him. It's disavowal. I don't know who you are, and they don't associate with him. Mr. Terpil, according to these accounts, now that he's arrested, was, in quotes, fired by the CIA and joined Mr. Korkola as a partner 3 years ago. I don't know whether or not that's true. The Watergate story cover-ups certainly were exposed as time went on. And as I said before, McCord Associates was a dummy front sent in 1971. Operation Chaos was an international group with the National Security Council, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the CIA, the FBI, the Army, combining domestically for terror and infiltration of all organizations, whether it was the lesbians, the gays, the women's movement, the American Indians, the blacks, neutralize the leaders, the United Prisoners Union. I talked about Popeye Jackson last week that was a victim of this group, and Richard Ober of the CIA in charge of Operation Chaos worked with James Angleton domestically. The way the CIA worked in the United States to make it legal was that if they had terrorism and links to international terrorism as a suspected connection, they could infiltrate in this country because they weren't supposed to work domestically. It should be obvious to everybody that the CIA practically runs every branch of this country, but terrorism was the excuse. So setting up this so-called left terrorism was an excuse to continue the bombing on the right. Unfortunately, the tape isn't long enough to go into these worldwide connecting links. Next week I'm going to pick it up where I left off here and ignore some of the cataclysmic world events because they're getting pretty good coverage, and continue with the update of the arrest of these men in New York City and see how much news has come out since this week. Terribly important stories, the Korean expose, the CIA agent of the assassination teams and their cover-up coming from that end, this assassination team and the cover-ups by the media coming from this end, and linking the two together through Moon and the anti-Castro Cubans and the Nazi money. We'll continue that on next week, tighten it up, clarify a little, but I want you to know what's happening with all this material now. Take care, and I'll be back with you next week. It's Mae Brussell in Carmel, California.